In July of 1758, 3 British forces advanced on New France from every direction. To the east, General Amherst's cannons thundered at the formidable fortress of Louisburg, as his men dug ever closer in a grueling siege. To the north, near Fort Ticonderoga, General Abercrombie's troops emerged from the woods and launched a bold assault on the French defenses near Rattlesnake Hill. To the south, General Forbes pressed westward toward Fort Duquesne, determined to drive the French from the contested Ohio country. From the wilderness of the frontier to the strategic waterways of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, British forces were poised to breach the gates of New France, while at sea the Royal Navy slowly tightened its grip on Atlantic supply lines. The colony was under siege, beset on all fronts. While France was busy on the battlefields of Europe trying to keep the British Empire and Prussia at bay, Britain reached across oceans with ruthless precision, determined to crush the French Empire and tear it apart. This was no ordinary campaign. It was characterized by the bloodiest open-field battle of the French and Indian War, a classic Vauban-style siege, and a desperate race for indigenous and colonial support on the frontier. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of New France. By the end of 1757, the French appeared to have gained significant momentum in the French and Indian War. They had triumphed at the Battle of Oswego in 1756, driving the British off Lake Ontario, and had successfully repelled British forces from Louisburg in 1757, denying them access to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Additionally, under Louis-Joseph de Montcalm-Gozon, Marquis de Montcalm de Saint-Véran, Montcalm for short, they had secured victory at the siege of Fort William Henry, effectively pushing British troops away from Lake George. In theory, the road to Fort Edward, and ultimately Albany, and thus the heartland of the 13 colonies, lay wide open. However, the aftermath of the famous massacre of Fort William Henry revealed serious problems for the French. Much of their resources, especially food and ammunition such as cannonballs, had been depleted. More importantly, many of their Native American allies abandoned the French cause after the siege. Frustrated that the spoils Montcalm had promised were never delivered, the French commander had promised the British safe conduct as part of the terms of surrender, something that was entirely alien to most native warriors. In an attempt to get what they believed they were owed, scalps, captives, and anything valuable they could trade, they attacked the retreating British column as it marched toward Fort Edward. The French tried to protect the British, but about 500 were taken as captives, and 185 were killed. Some Native Americans even attacked and scalped the sick inside the hospital at Fort William Henry. In a tragic twist of fate, doing so exposed them to numerous diseases, the most devastating of which was smallpox. After the warriors retreated to their communities, some more than 1,500 kilometers away from Fort William Henry, the disease spread rapidly among native communities. They came to believe that the French were to blame, leading them to withdraw their support from the foreign power in battle. The loss of native support forced the French to rely more heavily on regular troops sent from France. Meanwhile, the ongoing 7 Years' War was draining resources in Europe, with a British naval blockade having the most serious impact by steadily restricting France's ability to send provisions, soldiers, and weapons to New France. Compounding the problem, a poor harvest had devastated food supplies in Canada, further straining French resources. By New Year's Day of 1758, William Pitt, the British Secretary of State, had become aware of this situation. His strategy for the conflict in North America was designed to exploit France's weaknesses. Because France was strong in Europe, having assembled about 100,000 men near its northern shore, Pitt planned to remain on the defensive, focusing his attacks where France was vulnerable, in North America and the Atlantic Ocean. To undermine French resistance, the Secretary of State ordered Admiral Henry Osborne and Admiral Edward Hawke to block the French fleet at Brest, La Rochelle, and Cartagena, ensuring they could not support New France. In America, Pitt envisioned a series of 3 offensives aimed at the frontier and New France's heartland around Quebec and Montreal. The first, most crucial attack would be against Louisburg, while additional strikes would target Fort Carillon and Fort Duquesne, stretching New France's forces thin and allowing the British to defeat them in detail. Brigadier General John Forbes gathered 6,000 men at Schenectady to cut directly through Pennsylvania from Carlisle and across two formidable mountain ranges, the Alleghenies and the Laurel Ridge, to attack Fort Duquesne, the future site of Pittsburgh. This advance was designed to weaken French control of the Ohio country and disrupt their trade with the Native American nations around the Great Lakes. Meanwhile, near the ruins of Fort William Henry, General James Abercrombie gathered a large force of 16,000 men to attack Fort Carillon and invade Canada directly across the New York frontier. Lastly, at Halifax, Nova Scotia, General Jeffrey Amherst gathered 14,000 men for the Louisburg campaign, aiming to open New France to an invasion through the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The British attack was ready to launch. In early 1758, the governor of New France, Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil, Marquis de Vaudreuil, Vaudreuil for short, had fewer than 6,000 regular troops, an estimated 7,000 militiamen, and a small number of Native American allies to face British forces reportedly numbering around 50,000. Vaudreuil did exactly what William Pitt's strategy called for. He divided the French forces into three groups, allocating about 5,000 troops to defend Fort Carillon and Louisburg, and sending a select force of around 3,000 to the Mohawk River and the northwestern frontier of New York. This meant the French would be heavily outnumbered in each campaign. However, they had a strategic advantage. They could rely on solid fortifications on all fronts. As a general rule, an attacking force needed roughly 3 times as many troops as the defenders to successfully besiege a fortress, so the French still had a fighting chance. In June of 1758, Montcalm departed Quebec for Fort Carillon, while François-Marie Le Marchand de Lannery moved to Fort Duquesne and Augustin de Beauchonnery de Drucourt was put in command of the defenses at Louisburg. Of all the fortresses held by the French on the American continent, Louisburg was the most formidable. Constructed as a star fort based on the principles of the renowned military engineer Sébastien Le Prêtre de Vauban, it was built to withstand the full force of an 18th century siege. On the landward side, Louisburg was defended by 2 well-constructed bastions, the King and Queen, and 2 half-bastions, the Dauphin and the Princess. On the seaside, 11 French warships, including 5 ships of the line, were anchored at the bay to protect Louisburg against naval attacks. The French had also reinforced the shoreline near the city to prevent a naval landing. At the time, Louisburg was known as the Gibraltar of the North, a high compliment since Gibraltar, famously called the Rock, was one of the most formidable fortresses of the era. However, even the strongest Vauban-style fortifications could only hold for so long. Ironically, while Vauban had revolutionized fortress design, he also developed an almost infallible method to break them. In this approach, known as siège en forme, or formal siege, attackers methodically dug zigzagging trenches toward the walls, making them hard to hit from the defenses. The attacker advanced in a calculated pattern, positioning artillery to strike from optimal angles, gradually wearing down the defenses, driving the defenders from the walls, and ultimately breaching the fortress by bringing cannons through a network of trenches all the way up to the fortification walls. Drucourt knew that Louisburg's survival depended on reinforcements from the French Navy breaking through Osborne's and Hawkes's blockades. If successful, the few ships at Louisburg and the French fleet could drive off the British ships in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and clear a path for fresh troops from the heartland of New France to reach the besieged fortress. If not, it was only a matter of time before the defenders were worn down. On the 2nd of June, the British fleet anchored at Gabarus Bay, roughly 5 kilometers from Louisburg. However, heavy rain limited their action to naval bombardment of the fortress from offshore. The assault landing at Louisburg began on the 8th of June 1758. 3 divisions of the invading force prepared to come ashore, with one under the command of James Wolfe, targeting a cove on the left flank. However, the French had fortified the shoreline, forcing the British to battle through rough seas and enemy fire. Wolfe initially tried to call off the landing, but one of his commanders, William Howe, misunderstood the signal and landed anyway. When Wolfe saw the unexpected success, he reversed his decision and ordered the rest of his division to land at the same spot. That night, the British established their siege camp near Freshwater Brook, about 2.5 kilometers from the fortress. On the 12th of June, Wolfe was dispatched to capture Lighthouse Point, which controlled the access to the harbor. With that secured, all the pieces were in place to begin a formal siege. On the 19th of June, after nearly a week of preparation, the British artillery batteries were finally in place, and Geoffrey Amherst gave the order to open fire at the city's bastions and the French ships in the harbor. The digging of siege trenches, parallels and ceps progressed steadily. By the 3rd of July, the British had constructed batteries within 550 meters of Louisburg's landward defenses. On the 6th of July, mortar shells and incendiary bombs began to fall inside the city. In mounting desperation, the French launched a series of night sorties to destroy the British batteries, but with little success. The French were becoming increasingly desperate, and not just at Louisburg, while the siege wore on with relentless bombardment by day and constant digging and entrenching by night. Farther to the west, General Abercrombie was ready to cross Lake George and open up a new front, while General Forbes had begun moving across the wilderness of Pennsylvania. The British offensive was poised to unleash its full force against New France. When Montcalm arrived at Fort Carillon, he had a mere 3,500 men at his disposal, and notably only 15 native allies had shown up. Rations were calculated to last a maximum of 9 days. Therefore, reinforcements from Quebec were Montcalm's only real hope of winning a protracted siege. However, what he didn't know was, as historian Fred Anderson puts it, quote, "The king, Louis XV, and his ministers were quietly writing New France out of France's grand strategy." France's resources were tied up in Europe, defending the coast against British raids and preparing for a possible invasion of England. As a result, Montcalm was largely on his own. Only François Gaston de Lévis, with 400 men, could be spared to reinforce Fort Carillon. Montcalm's adjutant noted, quote, "Our situation is critical. Action and audacity are our sole resources." On the 6th of July, French scouts at the northern end of Lake George spotted 4 columns of small boats slowly advancing across the water. Thousands of them, according to soldiers' journals, covering the lake from shore to shore. At the head of the fleet was Lord George Howe, General James Abercrombie's second-in-command. Howe was a seasoned officer, thoroughly familiar with warfare on the frontier's woodlands. He enjoyed the complete confidence of William Pitt, which is precisely why he had been placed under Abercrombie, whom Pitt deeply distrusted due to his lack of battlefield experience. Even Abercrombie's own soldiers didn't trust him, referring to him as Granny. Though Pitt wanted Howe to lead the expedition against Fort Carillon, Abercrombie's political connections and seniority secured him the top command. As Abercrombie's massive force of 16,000 troops closed in, the French, stunned by the size of the approaching army, retreated into the forest, abandoning much of their baggage. Howe, leading the advance guard, gave chase through the dense woods. The French rearguard fought a delaying action, frequently turning to slow their pursuers. Then, before the British could finally engage, a musket shot rang out from a concealed position, striking Lord Howe and killing him instantly. This was a devastating blow to the British morale before the battle had even begun. With Howe's death, the army lost most of its strategic edge. He had trained alongside Roger's Rangers, the elite scouting force intimately familiar with the frontier, and was one of the few officers with both an understanding of the unique demands of wilderness warfare and the authority to influence Abercrombie's decisions. Whether due to the impact of Howe's loss or some other failure, Abercrombie did not regroup his men or continue the advance. Instead, the army made camp and delayed any further movement until the next day. Even then, they proceeded only halfway toward Fort Carillon, a distance that could be covered in 2 hours, before stopping again to camp. One provincial surgeon captured the growing frustration, writing, quote, "I can't but observe since Lord Howe's death, business seems a little stagnant." It was not until the 8th of July that Abercrombie finally ordered scouts to reconnoiter the enemy's position. From the edge of the forest, they saw that the French had taken full advantage of the 2 days since the British landing. Montcalm, fully aware that the stone walls of Fort Carillon wouldn't hold for long, had ordered his men to pick up shovels and axes. On the rise of the hill behind the fort, they built a formidable wooden field fortification. This position was crucial because cannons placed there could easily target the fort, which is why the French were determined to hold it. In front of a sandbag reinforced palisade and breastwork, they carved out a deadly killing field. The forward slope was lined with a tangled mass of abatis, sharpened tree limbs and felled trunks designed to break the enemy formations and slow their advance. Further down, another barrier of sharpened stakes was erected to disrupt approaching infantry formations and channel them into the line of fire. The entire hillside had been transformed into a gauntlet, ideal for cutting down attackers with grape shot and musket volleys. Any frontal assault on this position would come at a terrible cost, staining the slope red with blood. Around midday of the 8th of July, Rufus Putnam was working on the fortifications of the entrenched British camp roughly 1.5 kilometers from Rattlesnake Hill. All day he had heard the thunder of cannons, crackling musket fire, and distant screams echoing through the woods. Like General Abercrombie, who also remained at the camp, Putnam had no clear idea of what was actually unfolding on top of the hill. Convinced he could take it quickly and then besiege Fort Carillon, Abercrombie had ordered a frontal assault on the French palisades. Remaining in the safety of the camp, he relied solely on sparse dispatches from the front, and simply continued ordering frontal assaults, completely unaware of the disaster his decisions were causing. Worse still, he kept the entire artillery at the camp, which left his infantry to attack without any supporting firepower. Up on the hill, British scouts were the first to reach the abatis. They drove off the French pickets and took up sniping positions, just as Lord Howe had taught them. For a brief moment, it looked like the British might take a measured approach, pushing slowly up the hill from cover to cover, possibly even outflanking the French defensive line. But Abercrombie's battle plan suggested otherwise. He had ordered 3 long infantry columns to push directly up the hill. Shortly after midday, more than 8,000 British soldiers advanced to the sound of drums and bagpipes, charging into the dense tangle of sharpened trees. The British right reached the first line of abatis before the other columns. As they came within range of the French muskets, they were met with a brutal volley. Caught in the open and tangled in the abatis, they were easy targets. Musket balls tore through the ranks as the French, firing from behind cover, picked them off at will. The killing field became a slaughterhouse. The soldiers were, quote, cut down like grass, wrote Joseph Nichols, a Massachusetts private. Another survivor recalled, quote, we had orders to run up to the breastwork and get in if we could, but we never reached it. Most men took cover behind trees, logs, and stumps, shielding themselves as best as they could from the relentless French fire. The ground was littered with the dead and dying. The situation grew so desperate that the French paused their volleys to let the smoke clear, allowing them to aim more accurately. Only on the British left did a handful of soldiers manage a desperate push that actually reached the base of the French wall. But those who successfully scaled the breastwork were met with bayonets and cut down immediately. Back at the entrenched camp, Rufus Putnam, worried he might be seen as a coward for not participating in the fighting, and volunteered to deliver ammunition to the front lines. When he arrived in the evening, he found the battlefield in chaos. No orders had come from the officers, and the soldiers, pinned down and leaderless, simply lay there, unable to advance, unable to retreat. They remained in place until sunset, when they began to quietly slip away, leaving behind the dead and most of the wounded. As night fell, waves of bloodied, broken men poured back into Abercrombie's camp. Only then did the full scope of the disaster at Rattlesnake Hill become apparent. With over 2,000 British dead, Abercrombie, terrified of a French counterattack, ordered an immediate retreat to the boats on Lake George. Confused and demoralized, the soldiers stumbled through the darkness toward the shore. As they neared the water, panic took over and the retreat dissolved into a full stampede for the boats. At dawn on the 9th of July, the largest British army ever assembled in North America was rowing for its life up Lake George, fleeing from an enemy less than a quarter its size, which wasn't even in pursuit. With their victory at the Battle of Fort Carillon, the French theoretically gained the ability to shift the balance of power at Louisburg. Montcalm could have marched his men north toward Montreal and then sent them to Louisburg by sea, while the French fleet attempted to break the naval blockade. But the French at Carillon lacked accurate intelligence, and shaken by Abercrombie's massive force, feared another British assault and decided to stay put, spending the rest of the summer reinforcing their defenses. At sea, the British also maintained control. The French fleet at La Rochelle remained blockaded by Admiral Edward Hawke, while at Cartagena, the French could only watch as the English under Henry Osborne eventually lifted the blockade, but only because Osborne knew that, on average, a ship of the line needed about 8 weeks to cross from Spain to North America. This meant the French ships couldn't reach Louisburg before October, by which time the campaigning season would be over and winter setting in. Meanwhile, at Louisburg, General Amherst was unaware of any bad news from the Battle of Fort Carillon and pressed on relentlessly. His trenches inched ever closer to the enemy bastions, and his batteries thundered at the town without pause. On the 21st of July, a red-hot cannonball struck one of the French ships of the line anchored in the harbor, igniting its powder magazine and causing a devastating explosion. The blast destroyed the ship and its 2 closest neighbors, burning all 3 vessels down to the waterline. However, the attackers also used red-hot cannonballs on the city, and by this point, fire was causing as much damage to the city as to the fleet. On the 22nd of July, the King's Bastion, the cornerstone of Louisburg's landward defenses, caught fire. Under a relentless rain of red-hot shot from British artillery, buildings within the fortress ignited faster than the overwhelmed fire crews could extinguish them. Exploiting the confusion, on the night of the 25th of July, hidden by a thick fog, sailors from the British fleet rode into the harbor. They boarded the 2 remaining ships of the line, setting one ablaze and towing the other, the 64-gun Bienfaisant, to safety across the harbor. The loss of the Bienfaisant, not only the final surviving ship of the line, but also the squadron's flagship, delivered a crushing blow to French morale. Worse still, the British intensified their efforts. Following Vauban's siege doctrine to the letter, they unleashed a relentless bombardment, firing nearly 1,000 rounds into the city over the next 12 days. By then, Drucour had little choice. Nearly a third of his garrison had been killed or wounded by bombardment or disease. Only 4 serviceable cannons remained in the last functioning battery. 6 British ships of the line were preparing to sail into the harbor and bombard the city from the undefended seaward side, and a breaching battery was poised to open fire at close range on the landward wall. On the morning of the 26th of July, with no hope of holding out and unwilling to sacrifice more lives needlessly, Drucour raised a flag of truce and requested terms for surrender. Louisburg had held out just long enough to prevent a British assault on Quebec in 1758. As the campaign season was slowly drawing to a close, and a winter assault on Canada was far from ideal. However, the eventual fall of Louisburg marked a turning point, triggering the collapse of French control across much of Atlantic Canada. From their foothold at Louisburg, British forces spent the remainder of the year driving out French troops and occupying settlements in what are now New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. On the final remaining front, the Western campaign against Fort Duquesne, Brigadier General Forbes had worked tirelessly to build a road across the wilderness of Pennsylvania. His efforts to wrest control of the Great Lakes and their valuable trade with the natives from the French were bolstered by two key developments. First, the British victory at Fort Frontenac in August of 1758, which cut off supplies to Fort Duquesne. And second, successful negotiations with the Ohio indigenous nations, formalized in the Treaty of Easton, where they agreed to abandon the French cause at Britain's urging. Outnumbered 10-1, with no native allies and dwindling supplies, the French commander of Fort Duquesne chose to set the fort ablaze and retreat. The British would soon build Fort Pitt on its ruins. With French control of the frontier collapsing, the Gulf of St. Lawrence open to invasion through Louisburg, and only Fort Carillon remaining as the main defensive stronghold between the advancing British and the heartland of New France, little stood in the way of an attack on Quebec and Montreal. The French Empire was about to crumble. If you found this video entertaining or educational, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Creating this content takes a lot of time and effort. Even a small tip can make a big difference in keeping the channel going. As a thank you, our Patreon supporters get regular updates and exclusive artwork previews. Your support means a lot. Thank you.